Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome
to
Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
optimal wellness
brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
So you're in high school.
Oh, okay, yes.
You know, you're talking to your guidance counselor and your guidance counselor says, Jasmine Ratchet, I think you'd be a really good genetic counselor. What does a genetic counselor do? Do you know?
It sounds like I'd be in a lab. In high school, Jasmine would think that's way too sciencey for me.
So I think there are a lot of things about genetics that people don't understand. So the idea behind this episode,
it's like bridging the gap between that super dense, hard to understand article you might have seen somewhere online and the type of things that people on their free time want to know about.
the fact is genetics will play an increasing role in optimal health and wellness over the next few decades. And genetic counselors are integral to making that happen. They're educating people about the implications of their genetic information and how that genetic information can go to promoting health and wellness in the long term, both for them as well as their relatives and ancestors. So Medcan's genetic counselors answer a lot of questions in this episode, but if you have questions that they don't answer, feel free to send them to us and we'll tackle them in a future episode. Send us an email at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
I'm Jazz.
I'm Chris. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
And today's episode, Allison Hazell, Medcan's Director of Clinical Innovation, is hosting a conversation
with Medcan's Director of Genetics, Jessica Gu,
and genetic counselor, Justin Lorentz. Their conversation includes:
how do you become a genetic counselor? What's the difference between the service provided by consumer-grade genetics tests and what Medcan provides?
Will you be able to choose your baby's eye color?
So the designer baby question.
Yeah, super interesting question in my opinion.
How can your genetic information impact your longevity?
Or your likelihood of being arrested for a crime.
Yeah, the Golden State Killer question. That's a good one.
Yeah.
What's the biggest misconception about what a genetic counselor does? We attack these questions and more in this episode.
Here's Allison Hazell.
Hi, I'm Allison Hazell, Medcan's Director of Clinical Innovation and a genetic counselor by training. And I'm here with two of my fellow genetic counseling colleagues, Jessica Gu, who's the Clinical Director of Genetics, and Justin Lorentz. I'm really excited to be chatting with you both today. Thanks for being here.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. This is great.
So I think the main reason why we thought this would be an interesting episode to do is really because I know from personal experience, and I know both of you have a lot of experience, that people generally don't have a good understanding about what genetic counselors are, what we do. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about genetics generally that in clinical work you end up correcting over and over again. And so we thought this might be a good way to get the word out and raise awareness about what we do, but also to correct some of those misconceptions that are out there.
I agree. I think this is a neat platform to be able to kind of go over some of those topics. I wonder if we can put this on record and put it in some of our counseling sessions when some of these things pop up.
Yeah. We'll just have it playing in the lounges. Yeah.
That's actually a great idea.
Yeah, I think the first question is a pretty obvious one, but curious to hear how you would explain sort of what a genetic counselor is.
What isn't a genetic counselor?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of a genetic counselor, I tell people, and we do a couple of things. We make complex genetic information simple for people to understand. We see people who either have a medical condition that we think might have a genetic explanation, and that's why they get referred over to us. But sometimes we also see healthy people, and we look to see if there might be some genetic predispositions that they may have. And if we do identify something in these individuals, our job is to make that genetic test result make sense to the person, and then make sure that they're being seen by the right people to manage them for whatever it is that's identified. But I mean, learning that information can sometimes be challenging. And another part of our role is to not only have that information make sense, but to help people process that information and understand what the implications are for them and potentially for other family members as we share our genes with other family members. So, you know, what don't we do? There's a lot that we cover in that territory. And the nice thing about that is that we give people the time to be able to really ask those questions and be with them through that process of learning this, life-altering sometimes information. Or if the results come back negative, have that make sense in the context of, perhaps a family history of something that is concerning.
Yeah, I sometimes try and explain it using the title. So I will say that we counsel individuals about genetic risk. It may not even have to do with genetic testing. It could be based on family history or symptoms, but it definitely can be based on genetic risk information. And it's just helping individuals, families, clinicians, and the general public understand where genetic risk can come from, what to look for, whether genetic testing is an option or appropriate, and how genetic results can apply and be used to help inform medical decisions.
I love that. And I do like the added layer of it's not just individuals or patients, that kind of working collaboratively with colleagues in the medical field is a really important piece of it. And something that I think we have a lot of benefit in being in a place like Medcan, where we have so many different types of providers around that we can kind of work alongside them. Okay, so maybe, Jess, I'll give this one to you. How do you become a genetic counselor?
It's a great question. So generally speaking, genetic counselors will have a master's degree, typically in genetic counseling, or some places might call it a degree in human genetics. And then here in Canada, genetic counselors have to be board certified, and that can either be by the American Board of Genetic Counselors or by the Canadian Board of Genetic Counselors. In order to enter the master's program, most individuals will need relevant courses or a degree. So for example, in biology or genetics or psychology, those are probably some common ones. And then it's approximately a 2-year program. You write your board exam, and then you are a full-fledged genetic counselor.
I've heard that in this current state, it's harder to get into a master's of genetic counseling than it is medical school. Do we think that that's accurate? Does anyone know?
Oh, it's so funny. I have a lot of individuals reach out to me who are interested in becoming a genetic counselor. And these are individuals who are still in high school or just starting their undergrad degree. And they already have more qualifications than I had when I was starting my master's degree. That being said, I also hear very similar stories for other programs. So I think it's just that in general, things are getting more competitive. There was a time when very few people did a master's degree, and now it's becoming more and more commonplace to do a master's degree. So perhaps that has something to do with it. Having not recently applied to medical school, I can't say whether one is harder than the other.
Yeah, I don't know if that's just like genetic counselor folklore or there's any truth to that statement.
I mean, I've heard it too. And I feel like they have a similar level of what you need in terms of curriculum and your academic proficiency. But I mean, when we were in school, there was just University of Toronto, McGill, University of British Columbia, and then University of Montreal. So it's competitive, I think, just because there's so few spots. Mm-hmm. And I guess it makes sense because we're trained in prenatal, in pediatrics, in adult, in cancer, and these other specialized clinics like ophthalmology and cardiology. Laboratory. And so the small numbers, it's a different beast, but it's still a beast.
I'm curious what you think the most common misconception that clients have that you're speaking to. Like, what's the thing that you clarify most often in your counseling sessions?
Yeah, I feel like I have an answer for that.
Okay.
I think a lot of people expect to find that they're going to have a gene mutation that's going to be meaningful to modify their healthcare in some way. The word gene mutation, technically those are called variations or genetic variations, and the ones that we focus on are pathogenic or likely pathogenic variations, but that's jargony, and so I just call them mutations. But a lot of people test negative, or a lot of people will just be a carrier for something and not have a gene mutation that's going to modify their care. I feel like that's a big misconception. But I mean, the fact is that if you are sitting in front of me and talking to me and you're over the age of 30, chances are most of your genes are working just fine, particularly if you're healthy. So what we're really looking for are these genes that would take us off guard. And they don't happen very often, but what they do, they're super meaningful. But I spend a lot of time saying, hey, a lot of your family history may not be explained by the genes that we test for. I think people put a lot of stock and store in their genetics that they're born with. But I mean, lots of medical conditions happen for other reasons other than what you're born with.
I agree with all of that. People assume we can test for everything genetically. And sometimes our understanding of the genetics just isn't there compared to some basic blood work that would be a better test for that particular condition. So for example, for type 2 diabetes, your blood glucose level is a much better test than any genetic test that's available today to predict your diabetes risk. Similarly, for high cholesterol or high blood pressure, the simple screening that's available is often better than something that we can offer today because we are focusing on these really rare and significant genetic changes that Justin mentioned. I do have a lot of individuals assume that their results are ready within minutes of their blood draw. And that is a common misconception that I work to correct because their blood sample has not even left the lab.
Another question that isn't on the list, but I'm curious to hear your take on it. Maybe Justin, I've heard you do a good explanation of this, so I'm going to put you on the spot here, but describing the difference between diagnostic testing and screening. Why is that important in the work that we do, and how do you explain the differences between those things?
Yeah, I do like that question. When you first said you're going to put me on the spot, I was a little nervous, but this is what I'm good with. So a good example of this is a test like non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT. What this test does is, well, I guess a better way of talking about it is what it maybe can't do. It can't diagnose a condition. What it does is, if you were to make an analogy of someone kind of going on an airplane and they have their luggage with them, an NIPT screening test is basically like the X-ray machine that scans your luggage before you go on the flight. And what it does is it kind of dings, hey, is there something we're concerned about here? Or says, hey, everything's perfectly fine. And if you're in that category where everything's perfectly fine, you can grab your bag and go on the flight, and we're done with that process. Alternatively, if the light kind of goes off, that's the screen or the NIPT test that comes back positive that says, hey, we have to do some additional testing, a diagnostic test. And what that looks like is opening up the bag and looking inside to see what's really going on. And that additional diagnostic testing would be something that Medcan wouldn't facilitate after an NIPT test, but we would facilitate a referral to have that process being done through other means. But yeah, the difference between a screen is kind of like the X-ray machine, and a diagnostic test is kind of opening up that bag of luggage that went through the X-ray machine, if there was a reason to open it up.
I love that. And I think it's understandable that people get those two things confused because we do use test and screen interchangeably. I like that analogy and that visual.
Except that I will clarify that we don't open women up if their NIPT is positive and look through them. I think what some people don't realize too is that healthcare is full of screening tests. The mammogram is a screening test, but nobody is criticizing the mammogram's ability to screen. The mammogram is only identifying individuals who need further testing to see if they could have breast cancer. The mammogram itself is not saying you have cancer. Just like a lot of these common screens that people do regularly, a lot of genetic screening is only meant to help identify who needs further testing.
I think as things like liquid biopsy testing, which is a screening test for early cancer, become more widely available, that is one of the things that I think we're going to need to do a lot of pre-test counseling or education around, making sure that people understand that a positive screening test doesn't equal a cancer diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of questions that come up. Maybe it's in the media, maybe it's kind of in individual counseling sessions related to linking DNA testing to a crime. You know, the whole Golden State Killer example. So Jess, this one's for you. If somebody does genetic testing, does it mean that they're going to be accused of a crime?
You know, now that you mention it, this is one of the most common questions I get. And my answer is always not to tell me about your crimes so I can't be implicated. But in general, when people think of DNA, they think of this one kind of amorphous hypothetical entity. But it's actually very different when you do genetic testing for clinical reasons versus genetic testing to determine relatedness or ancestry. These are actually completely different tests that are done. Typically, the genetic testing that's done for clinical reasons, it would be very difficult, although not impossible, to use that information to see if you're related to someone else. I don't think it would give you a definitive answer in terms of relatedness. And that's simply because they're not looking at the specific types of genetic markers that can determine with great accuracy whether you truly are related to an individual. In contrast, ancestry testing or testing to determine if your DNA matches or could be a match for another DNA sample, that is looking at markers such as one is called microsatellites, and that is not something that clinical testing will typically look at. Clinical testing, that data is not necessarily available for comparison. I'm not an investigator, but I imagine that when individuals are trying to determine if a DNA sample could be a match for anyone in the general public, they're using public databases or people who have consented to share their DNA. These individuals are not going to clinical genetic testing labs. They are going to these public databases to check for relatedness. If they were to try to go to a clinical lab, there would be privacy regulations in place, and there would be a limit to what they could find out.
That's a great answer. I think that helps. There is, an important distinction, which you brought up, is the difference between public databases and genetic testing through a clinical genetics lab, which is obviously very different, which kind of brings me actually to privacy and security, because I think that that's something that people will also ask about a lot or have concerns about generally, but genetics kind of has a fear factor, I think, sometimes associated with it. So, maybe in the context of whole genome sequencing, which we recently started to do, wondering how you talk to your clients about privacy and security generally when it comes to genetic testing. I don't know, Justin, if you want to take this one.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty good with this one. And to your point, Ali, about the difference between that public or genetic testing that we get from doing direct-to-consumer testing versus clinical testing is a medical test result. It has just the same amount of data privacy as breast MRI. It's a test that's part of your medical record. And so when it comes to privacy in Canada, we have this Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which is a really powerful piece of legislation that really prevents life insurance companies that do critical illness insurance. It prevents them from accessing, requesting, using your genetic test results, either for coming up with what services you're eligible for or what your premiums are. And so insurance companies can use some of your health data against you. They can also use your family history against you, but they can't use your genetic test results, which is, a pretty amazing thing. And we have one of the, as far as I'm concerned, and from what I know, one of the strongest genetics laws in the world when it comes to genetics protection. And so it is something that people are concerned about. And if they're not asking me about it, I make sure to tell them about it, because I'm really proud of that legislation that we have. It's some easy thing to diffuse a concern.
And there's also something that we explain to our patients, which is the difference between data that could be traced back to them, which only will be shared within their circle of care at Medcan, and de-identified data, which is data that cannot be traced back to them, that often laboratories and clinics will use to help further the world's knowledge of a particular topic like genetics. Something like, there are 10,000 people that went through this particular test, and here's what we found. And it's just meant to help healthcare providers be aligned and learn from each other. I find that a lot of patients and clients are happy that they can contribute in this very small way to the world's knowledge, and also equally happy that none of that can be traced back to them.
Okay, so I like to think that this question is becoming less frequent, especially at cocktail parties, because people are becoming more educated, but it does still come up. So I'm going to bring it up here. Designer babies. Is that what we do? Is that our role as genetic counselors, is helping people design babies?
It is not. And it is a common question. I remember when I was starting school for genetic counseling, it's something that so many people assumed I was about to do with my life.
Right.
The concept of designer babies, I think it's still a very theoretical, hypothetical, and potentially in the gray zone of ethical. So today, what is possible is a particular test called pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT, which is done in conjunction with IVF, or in vitro fertilization. If there is a known hereditary condition in the family and they know what mutation or mutations are causing it in the family, they can test embryos prior to implantation to see which embryos could have the mutations in the family and which ones screen negative for that particular mutation. There's also a different type of pre-implantation genetic testing that's done to screen embryos for chromosome conditions. That's called PGT-A, where the A stands for aneuploidy or chromosomal abnormalities. And that test is just meant to increase the chance of a successful implantation and pregnancy with IVF. So really, that's how we are, quote unquote, designing babies today.
Okay, but like the answer is no, right?
The answer is no.
The other part of it is that we don't know necessarily what the minor genetic factors are that even cause some of these things. And a lot of these conditions are lifestyle and environment, but there is one really interesting tool, and that's comparing people who have a medical condition. So for example, we got a whole bunch of people who get type 2 diabetes earlier in life. And let's say we have 10,000 of them. What we can do is we can do whole genome sequencing on every single one of these people and find out what little markers or parts of their genome do they all have in common. And we don't necessarily know what the mutation is, but we know that everyone has a mutation in this gene, and who knows what that gene does. And the association between all these people having that change and them all having a medical condition makes us think this change must be important to that medical condition. We don't necessarily understand why. And if we can find like 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 of those markers, we may be able to start predicting some of these things like diabetes, like cardiovascular risk. But yeah, less designer baby, more like what's going to happen to my baby when it's born. But if one thing's true about our world of genetics is that it's really difficult to simplify. And if we are simplifying it, and we're either looking at it really basically or we're not looking at the full picture.
Yeah. I feel like the theme throughout my career, as I learn more, is like it's more complicated than I thought, right? Like the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. A common area I think that comes up is what is the difference between those types of genetic tests that you can order online? You get a kit mailed to you, you kind of get your results online. It might be something that's kind of fun. People gift them to each other at holiday time. That we typically call kind of recreational genetics versus medical genetics. And what's the difference between those two? How is that different from kind of what we do at Medcan? Jess, do you want to take this one?
Sure. The kind of testing that you're talking about here, the ones you see on the subways, you get the mail-in kit, you get it as a gift. These are truly recreational, and that means that they should be done for fun. They should not be done to change or make medical decisions. As an example, recreational genetic testing will often focus on traits and less on medical information. So we were talking about hair color and eye color, whether you like the taste of cilantro. This kind of information will not affect your medical care, but it's really cool. What parts of the world could you be from? Could you have ancestors or relatives that you didn't realize? A lot of these recreational genetic testing companies will use a technology called SNP-based testing. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, meaning they're only looking for specific changes. So you have all of these genes, you have all this genetic information, and these companies are saying, at this particular spot, do you have this particular change? Yes or no? Clinical genetic testing will be looking for any possible clinically relevant genetic change in any of the relevant genes. So using a much more comprehensive and in-depth technology and looking at many more genes. And so I always say, do recreational genetic testing for fun. Don't use any of that information to make medical decisions, and do medical genetic testing not for fun because you want medical information.
It's confusing though. A lot of the companies will mix this like fun recreational trait-based testing with medical information. It all kind of is presented in the same way, and it's hard to decipher kind of what to take seriously or what not to. But I think that that's a great, if you're looking for something for fun, then definitely go that route.
And these companies have made genetic testing so accessible, and it's such a good conversation piece. I love that people know what genetic testing is, have experienced maybe some genetic testing already. But if there isn't a physician and a genetic counselor involved in that test, then maybe it's not the right test for a medical reason.
I remember when we first started 10 years ago, we were doing genetic testing. We had to explain genes, that genes lived in cells, and went through the whole process. And now I take for granted the fact that everyone knows what a gene is. People are very comfortable with this language now because of, in part, by some of these recreational tests. They've really normalized a really important part of healthcare, and a part of healthcare that's becoming more and more important. It's weird to know, your genetic predisposition to cancer, and then also like the color of your eyes, like in the same spot. Whoa.
Well, and I think there's interesting stats around the false positive rate. It's like 40% of the results are actually false positives, which is very different than what we would expect from a clinical genetic test. So that's the reason why we want to validate it through a clinical lab.
And contrary to what some people think, it's not because the test was done on saliva versus blood.
Mm-hmm.
Saliva samples are equally accurate as blood because your genes are the same in all of your cells. It's because they're not using an accurate technology.
Mm-hmm.
They're skimming the surface, whereas we are really diving in there, opening up that luggage maybe, and trying to determine if there is a mutation, double checking that the mutation is there before we tell anyone how they need to use this information to inform their medical choices.
Okay, so question for each of you. In 5 words or less, can you explain why you decided to become a genetic counselor?
I love genetics and people.
I cannot do that. I feel like a lot of times when someone approaches a field like genetic counseling, you do it because you like biology, you like genetics, you like people. And this was a really cool opportunity to be able to marry both of those interests. A lot of people work in a lab and don't like it, and they don't want to leave genetics quite yet. And so this is a fallback for them. And that was how it worked for me.
Great. Thank you.
What about you, Allie?
Genetics, people, also the ethics of it. I learned about genetic counseling through a women and reproductive health sociology course. So the ethics of how genetic testing interacts with our decision making was really the piece that drew me in.
Do you have like mentors? People who like you looked up to like got you into the field initially?
You know, it's funny, I didn't, because like you said, this was a different time when I was looking to become a genetic counselor, and I'd piecemeal together what I thought this career would look like and what I thought this profession was. And I think like day 2 of genetic counseling school, I was like, oh, this profession is so much more than even I had figured out.
How about you, Justin?
Yeah, I like biology, but I like plants. I was an algae kid in undergrad. And I was like, cool, like I like the environment. Let's like save things, no invasive species. And I did a human genetics class because I needed to. And Kathleen Buckley, a genetic counselor in Kitchener-Waterloo, taught one course. And I'm like, oh, like your job is the coolest. Let's do this. And I just totally realigned my entire life to no longer work with algae and instead human genetics.
I think you made a good decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I do. I still know a weird amount about algae.
Algae doesn't talk back, does it, when you tell them about their genes?
No, it does not.
Mine was actually Jill Davies, who was the genetic counselor who started the genetic counseling program at Medcan. You know, it's, I think, testament to Medcan's vision that we've had a program since 2005, I think, when it was initially started, and how much it's grown. So, you know, sitting here with you guys, it's so nice to get your perspective on things, but I feel so lucky that we have a team of, I think there's 6 clinical genetic counselors now on our team who we get to work with and collaborate with every day, and really shows sort of how this field has grown over the years. Again, I'm Allison Hazell, Director of Clinical Innovation at Medcan. It's been a pleasure, Jess. It's been a pleasure, Justin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks.
That was Allison Hazell, Medcan's Director of Clinical Innovation, in conversation with Medcan Director of Genetics, Jessica Gu,
and Medcan Genetic Counselor, Justin Lorentz. If you've ever thought about getting your genome sequenced or, you know, learning about what sort of diseases might be potentially down the road for you, these are some really interesting things that you could know and could really affect the way you live. So if you want to check that out, you can email bookingteam@medcan.com, or you can call 416-350-5900.
And if you have any additional questions about what a genetic counselor does or about genetics in general, email us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com, and we could use them in a future episode.
Yeah, we also have some cool research on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com, and we always post pretty cool social media hits on Twitter and Instagram. Check out Medcan Live Well.
Jazz, who produces Eat Move Think?
Well, that's us. We are Ghost Bureau. I'm the managing producer. You are executive producer. Who else do we have around here?
Helping with social media and strategy support is Chantal Gertan,
Andrew Imex,
and Emily Bozek.
We love them. We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.